The mess hall of the Galactic Defense Station Omega 7 buzzed with the usual evening chatter. Soldiers from dozens of species sat clustered around metal tables, their voices creating a symphony of clicks, growls, and electronic translations. The air recyclers worked overtime to manage the mix of atmospheric requirements, creating a slight haze that caught the artificial lighting. Captain Zekthor of the reptilian Scalaris Empire leaned back in his chair, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. His yellow eyes gleamed with amusement as he watched the newest arrivals to their joint military base. A small group of humans sat quietly in the corner, picking at their rations with an air of resignation that seemed to follow their species wherever they went. "Look at them," Zekthor hissed to his companion, a hulking Ursoid named Graxon whose bear-like features were twisted into what passed for a grin among his people. The mighty humans, conquerors of Earth, masters of their tiny corner of space. Graxon's mechanical translator rendered his deep rumbling laughter into standard galactic. "I heard they actually believe their own propaganda. Something about being great warriors." The massive alien's claws scraped against his meal tray. "Have you seen their recruitment videos? They show these ancient conflicts where they fought with primitive weapons. Swords and spears, can you imagine?" At a nearby table, several insectoid Chithari soldiers turned their compound eyes toward the conversation. Their leader, Subcommander KLX Vex, clicked her mandibles in what her species considered humor. "My intelligence reports indicate humans have mythology about individual soldiers defeating entire armies. They call them legends and heroes." "Heroes," Zekthor repeated the word with obvious disdain. "What a quaint concept. Individual glory in warfare. How perfectly primitive." The conversation was growing louder, drawing attention from other tables. A group of crystalline silicoids rotated their geometric heads to observe, their thoughts shared through quantum entanglement, creating a subtle harmonic hum of agreement with the mockery. "I researched their military history before this assignment," announced Lieutenant Vexhai, a slender ethereal whose translucent skin showed the glowing neural pathways beneath. "They have stories about something called the Medal of Honor. Apparently, they give shiny pieces of metal to soldiers who perform impossible acts of bravery." "Impossible being the key word," Graxon rumbled. "Because such things are by definition impossible." The humans in the corner seemed to shrink further into themselves. Most were young, fresh from training facilities on Earth or the outer colonies. They had joined the Galactic Defense Force with dreams of proving their species belonged among the stars, only to find themselves the constant target of condescension from their alien colleagues. Private Martinez, barely 19 and still adjusting to the artificial gravity, glanced nervously at his squad mates. "Maybe we should just eat somewhere else," he whispered. Corporal Chun, a few years older and trying to project confidence she didn't feel, shook her head. "We have as much right to be here as anyone else. Just ignore them." But the voices were getting harder to ignore. "Tell me, KLX Vex," Zekthor called out, his voice carrying across the mess hall. "What was that human legend you mentioned in yesterday's briefing? Something about a single warrior holding off an entire army." The Chithari officer's mandibles clicked rapidly. "Ah yes, the Battle of Thermopylae. 300 Spartan warriors supposedly held off hundreds of thousands of Persian soldiers." Her translation device somehow managed to convey sarcasm. Of course, the historical records show it was actually a much larger Greek force, but humans prefer their simplified version. "And then there's their medieval period," added another voice from across the room. A floating Vorthan, essentially a sentient gas cloud contained in an environmental suit, joined the conversation. "They have tales of knights defeating dragons. Mythological creatures, of course, but they treat these stories as if they contain some profound truth about human nature." The human table had fallen completely silent. Several of the younger soldiers were staring at their food, their faces red with embarrassment and suppressed anger. "Don't forget their modern mythology," Graxon continued, warming to his theme. "Something called Hollywood. They create fictional scenarios where individual humans save entire planets with nothing but primitive weapons and determination." "The most ridiculous part," Zekthor said, his voice carrying a note of genuine puzzlement, "is that they seem to actually believe this nonsense. As if will and courage could overcome superior firepower and numbers." At this point, about half the mess hall was listening to the conversation. Species that had little in common except their membership in the Galactic Defense Force found themselves united in their amusement at human pretensions. Even a normally reserved aquatic MERS had paused their feeding to listen through their environmental tanks. It explains their poor performance in actual combat situations. Observe Commander THYSS, a senior reptilian officer. They keep expecting individual heroics to matter. They don't understand that modern warfare is about technology, superior numbers, and proper tactical coordination. They've only been in space for, 200 years. Vexhi's neural pathways flared brighter with excitement. Most species require at least a millennium to develop proper military doctrine. Humans are still thinking like their primitive ancestors. The mockery was becoming more systematic now, as if the various species were conducting an impromptu seminar on human inadequacy. Charts and data displays began appearing on personal tablets as officers pulled up statistics and historical analyses. "Look at these casualty ratios from the border wars," announced Captain Zakmar, a spider-like arachnoid whose 8 eyes focused independently on different data streams. Human units consistently take higher losses than equivalent forces from other species. They lack proper survival instincts. They volunteer for dangerous assignments at rates far above galactic averages, added KLX Vex, consulting her own data. Statistically, this indicates either poor risk assessment capabilities or some form of species-wide mental instability. The young humans at their table were beginning to look genuinely distressed. Private Martinez had stopped eating entirely, his hands clenched into fists. Corporal Chun was trying to maintain composure, but her jaw was tight with suppressed fury. "Perhaps," Zekthor said with theatrical thoughtfulness, "we should be grateful for their delusions. If they actually understood their limitations, they might demand safer assignments. As it stands, they're quite useful for high-risk missions that we'd rather not waste competent soldiers on." The laughter that followed this comment was particularly harsh. Even species that normally maintained strict military discipline were openly chuckling at the suggestion that humans served as expendable shock troops. It was at this moment that the mess hall door opened with a soft hiss, and a figure entered that caused the laughter to die away in scattered waves. Conversations continued in some corners where beings hadn't yet noticed the newcomer, but a strange quiet began to spread through the room like ripples in still water. The figure was human, but unlike the young soldiers huddled at their corner table, this one moved with an easy confidence that spoke of decades of experience. He was older, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he'd spent considerable time squinting into hostile environments. His uniform was standard issue, but it bore the wear patterns of actual use rather than parade ground precision. What drew the most attention, however, were the decorations on his chest. Even species unfamiliar with human military traditions could recognize the significance of the small metal rectangles and hanging medallions. This was clearly a veteran of numerous campaigns, someone who had earned recognition through actual combat rather than training exercises. The man moved through the mess hall with purpose, collecting a meal tray and filling it with the standard nutritional paste that served as universal military rations. His presence seemed to create a bubble of silence that followed him as he walked, though he gave no indication of noticing the attention he was drawing. He paused at the human table, where the young soldiers looked up with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Veterans were rare among human forces in the Galactic Defense Fleet, and this one clearly had stories to tell based on the collection of campaign ribbons across his uniform. "Mind if I join you?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the subtle rasp that came from breathing too many different atmospheres over the years. "Of course, sir," Corporal Chin said quickly, though the man's uniform indicated he was actually a sergeant rather than an officer. The distinction seemed irrelevant given the obvious respect he commanded simply by existing. As he settled into his chair, the conversation around the mess hall began to resume, though at a noticeably lower volume. There was something about the veteran's presence that made the previous mockery seem somehow inappropriate, though most of the alien soldiers couldn't quite put their finger on why. "Rough crowd tonight," the sergeant observed mildly, taking a bite of his rations without any apparent concern for the dozens of eyes still tracking his movements. "They were talking about human military history," Private Martinez said quietly, "making jokes about our legends and heroes, saying we believe in impossible things." The sergeant nodded slowly, chewing thoughtfully. "Legends can be tricky things. Sometimes they grow in the telling until they bear little resemblance to what actually happened. And sometimes, he paused, meeting each of the young soldiers' eyes in turn. Sometimes they're not legends at all. Sometimes they're just things that happen to get written down. Across the room, Zekthor was watching the interaction with interest. Something about the human veteran's demeanor bothered him, though he couldn't identify exactly what. The man carried himself like someone accustomed to command, but his rank insignia indicated he was merely enlisted personnel. It was a contradiction that didn't fit neatly into the reptilian's understanding of proper military hierarchy. "Sergeant," Corporal Chun said carefully, "were you in the border wars?" The older man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Among other places, the border wars had been the Galactic Defense Force's first major conflict, a brutal campaign against an aggressive hive mind species that had threatened several inhabited systems. Human forces had participated, though their contribution was generally regarded as minimal by most galactic historians. The official records showed standard casualty rates and unremarkable performance statistics. "What was it really like?" asked Private Rodriguez, the youngest of the group. Before the sergeant could answer, Zekthor's voice carried across the room once again. The reptilian had been monitoring the human table and couldn't resist the opportunity to continue his earlier entertainment. "I hope you're not filling those youngsters' heads with more heroic nonsense, human," he called out with obvious amusement. "They need to understand reality if they're going to survive their first real engagement." The mess hall fell silent again. This was a direct challenge, issued publicly with clear intent to humiliate. Under normal military protocol, a sergeant would be expected to show deference to a captain, regardless of species. The young humans at the table tensed, waiting for their veteran to back down or offer some diplomatic response. Instead, the sergeant slowly turned in his chair to face the reptilian officer. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his posture that made several nearby aliens unconsciously lean away from him. "Captain," he said politely, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "I don't believe we've been introduced." Zekthor's forked tongue flicked out nervously, though he tried to maintain his air of superiority. "Captain Zekthor, 3rd Assault Wing, Scalaris Empire Forces. And you are?" "Sergeant First Class William O'Brien," the human replied. "Retired. These days I just help train new recruits." The simplicity of the response seemed to encourage Zekthor, who had been expecting some elaborate title or boastful claim. "Well then, Sergeant O'Brien, perhaps you can explain to your young charges why humans continue to perpetuate these ridiculous stories about individual heroism. Surely someone with your experience understands the realities of modern warfare." O'Brien stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was not particularly tall or physically imposing, especially compared to some of the alien species present, but something about his presence commanded attention. "You know, Captain," he said conversationally, "you're absolutely right about one thing. Modern warfare is about technology, superior numbers, and proper tactical coordination." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "But there's one factor you might be overlooking." "And what would that be?" Zekthor asked, though some instinct was beginning to warn him that he might not like the answer. O'Brien's expression didn't change, but his eyes took on a quality that made several experienced soldiers in a room unconsciously check their weapons' locations. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the other side doesn't get the memo." The silence that followed was different from the previous quiet moments. This wasn't the expectant hush of beings waiting for entertainment. This was the profound stillness that precedes violence, when predators and prey alike recognize that something fundamental has changed in their environment. O'Brien remained standing, waiting. Around the room, various species were beginning to reassess the human veteran with a growing realization that they might have made a significant error in judgment. The young humans at the table were staring up at their sergeant with a mixture of awe and confusion. They had never seen anyone face down a room full of hostile aliens with nothing more than quiet confidence and carefully chosen words. Captain Zekthor found himself in an uncomfortable position. Military protocol demanded that he maintain his authority in front of subordinates from multiple species, but something about the human's demeanor suggested that pushing the confrontation further might lead to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. "I'm not sure I understand your meaning, Sergeant," he said carefully. O'Brien's smile was small and entirely without warmth. "Oh, I think you understand perfectly, Captain. You've done your research on human military history. You know about our legends and our heroes. The question is whether you've bothered to research why those legends exist in the first place. He took a single step closer to the reptilian's table, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. You see, Captain, there's something about human psychology that your analysis might have missed. We don't tell stories about heroes because we think they're impossible. We tell them because they remind us what's possible when impossible becomes the only option left. The tension in the mess hall was thick enough to cut with a plasma blade. Sergeant O'Brien stood motionless, his weathered hands hanging loosely at his sides, but every being in the room could sense the coiled potential in his stance. The veteran's words hung in the recycled air like an unexploded ordnance, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. Captain Zekthor's yellow eyes narrowed as he processed the human's response. The reptilian's natural predator instincts were sending conflicting signals. Everything about the sergeant's physical appearance suggested he should be easy prey, smaller than most species, lacking natural weapons or armor, relying on primitive mammalian reflexes. Yet something deeper, more primal, was screaming warnings. "Stories," Zekthor said finally, his forked tongue tasting the air for chemical signs of aggression. "Pretty words, Sergeant. But this is reality, not some human fairy tale." O'Brien nodded thoughtfully, as if the reptilian had made a perfectly reasonable point. "You're absolutely right, Captain. Reality is what matters. So let me share some reality with you." The sergeant walked slowly toward the center of the mess hall, his boots making soft contact sounds against the metal floor. As he moved, conversations at other tables died away completely. Even the aquatic mers stopped their feeding cycles, their large eyes pressing against the transparent walls of their environmental tanks. "The border wars," O'Brien said conversationally, stopping near a large display screen that normally showed duty rosters and announcements. "You mentioned them earlier. Brutal conflict. The Devourers had already consumed 17 systems before the Galactic Defense Force managed to mount an effective response." He gestured to the screen, which remained blank. "Funny thing about military records. They tell you casualty numbers, unit deployments, strategic outcomes. Very clean, very organized. What they don't tell you is what it feels like when your drop ship crashes on a planet where everything wants to eat you." Private Martinez leaned forward unconsciously, along with most of the other young humans in the room. Even the alien soldiers were listening now, though many tried to maintain expressions of skeptical indifference. "Kepler, 442b, O'Brien continued, his voice taking on the distant tone of someone accessing old memories. "Beautiful planet before the Devourers arrived. Terraformed by the Centauri Colony Foundation. 3 million human settlers, plus diplomatic missions from a dozen other species. Captain HFY, the senior reptilian officer who had joined the earlier mockery, found herself leaning forward despite her better judgment. Military history was her specialty, and she prided herself on knowing every significant engagement of the border wars. "I don't recall any major battles on Kepler, 442b, she said carefully. The system fell before defense forces could mount a significant intervention." O'Brien's smile was grim. "That's because there weren't any major battles, Commander. Just a lot of small ones. The kind that don't make it into the official histories because they're too messy for clean strategic analysis." The sergeant seemed to be warming to his story now, though his casual demeanor somehow made his words more unsettling rather than less. "The Devourers hit the system with everything they had. Hive ships, bioforms, conversion clouds. Standard procedure for them. Overwhelm the defenses, consume the population, move on to the next target. Should have been over in 72 hours. He paused, glancing around the room at the assembled faces. Dozens of different species, representing the military might of half the galaxy, all hanging on the words of a single human sergeant. "Except they made one small mistake," O'Brien said quietly. "They left some of us alive. Graxon, the massive Ursoid who had been particularly vocal in his mockery earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his reinforced chair. "What do you mean, left you alive? That's not Devourer doctrine. They don't take prisoners." "No," O'Brien agreed. They don't. But when you crash land a troop transport in the middle of a bioform swarm, sometimes you end up scattered across a continent in groups too small for them to bother with. At least initially." The veteran reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of metal. Even from across the room, the alien soldiers could see it was some kind of human military decoration, a simple star suspended from a faded ribbon. 17 humans, O'Brien said, holding the metal loosely in his palm. That's all that survived the crash of Transport 77 Alpha. 17 soldiers against an entire planetary invasion force. Subcommander KLX Vex clicked her mandibles nervously. Surely you didn't engage the enemy directly. Standard protocol for isolated units is to evade and await extraction. Standard protocol, O'Brien repeated, nodding. Good point. Except extraction wasn't coming. The defense fleet had been forced out of the system, and the Devourers were systematically consuming every population center on the planet, including the refugee camps where the survivors from the cities were gathering. He turned the metal over in his fingers, and the aliens could see it was worn smooth in places, as if it had been handled countless times. So we had a choice. Follow standard protocol, hide in the wilderness, and watch 3 million civilians get eaten alive. Or do something incredibly stupid. The mess hall was completely silent now. Even the environmental systems seemed to have quieted, as if the station itself was listening to the sergeant's words. What did you do? Asked Corporal Chun, speaking for everyone in the room. O'Brien looked at her for a moment, then back at the metal in his hand. We decided to be heroes. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Several alien officers exchanged glances, remembering their earlier mockery of human heroic ideals. The concept that had seemed so absurd an hour ago suddenly felt much more serious. 17 soldiers, O'Brien continued, against bioform swarms numbering in the hundreds of thousands. No support, no heavy weapons, no hope of victory in any conventional sense. Lieutenant Vexhi's neural pathways flared with confusion. The mathematics alone makes such an engagement impossible. Even with superior tactics and positioning, the numbers are insurmountable. You're absolutely right, O'Brien said calmly. It was impossible, which is why we didn't try to win. Commander THYSS blinked slowly, her reptilian brain working to process this apparent contradiction. If you didn't try to win, what was your objective? O'Brien's expression became distant, as if he was seeing something far beyond the walls of the mess hall. We try to hurt them. We try to make them angry. We try to make them focus on us instead of the civilians. He began walking again, moving between the tables of alien soldiers who tracked his movement with their various sensory organs. The first attack was a textbook guerrilla operation. Hit their supply nodes, fade back into the wilderness. Except Devourers don't really have supply lines in the traditional sense. They just consume local biomass and convert it to their needs. Graxon's translator rendered his deep rumble as a question. Then, what was the strategic value of your attacks? None, O'Brien admitted. From a strategic perspective, we might as well have been throwing rocks at a battleship. But strategy wasn't the point. Psychology was. The sergeant stopped near the Chithri table, looking down at Subcommander KLX Vex with something that might have been pity. See, here's the thing about Devourers that your intelligence briefings probably didn't mention. They're not just mindless killing machines. They're intelligent. They adapt. And, like most intelligent species, they can be made to feel frustration. KLX Vex's compound eyes focused on the human with uncomfortable intensity. You're suggesting you conducted psychological warfare against a hive mind? Not suggesting, O'Brien corrected, stating, we made ourselves the most annoying problem they had ever encountered. Every time they tried to organize a major feeding operation, we'd hit them from a different angle. Never were they expected. Never when they expected. The veteran's voice took on a note of grim satisfaction. We couldn't stop them from consuming the planet, but we could make it take 10 times longer than they wanted. We could force them to divert resources to hunting us. We could make them pay for every mile of ground. Captain Zek Thor had been silent during this recitation, but now he spoke up with carefully controlled skepticism. Even assuming you could mount effective harassment operations, 17 soldiers could not significantly impact a planetary invasion. The scale is too large. O'Brien turned to face the reptilian captain directly, and something in his expression made Zek Thor's survival instincts scream warnings. You want to know about scale, Captain? He asked quietly. Let me tell you about scale. The sergeant began moving again, but now his steps had a different rhythm, almost like a predator circling prey. Several alien soldiers unconsciously shifted their positions to keep him in sight. Day 3 of operations. We've been hitting their forward scouts, nothing major. Figure we might have a week before they organized a serious response. Instead, we woke up to find bioform hunters surrounding our camp. O'Brien's voice remained conversational, but there was an undercurrent of something that made the universal translator struggle to find appropriate emotional context. 50 of them, purpose-bred for tracking and killing small groups of enemies. Each one bigger than your friend Graxon here, with reflexes that make a striking serpent look sluggish. The Ursoid in question shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his massive claws unconsciously extending from his paw sheaths. Standard tactical doctrine says when you're outnumbered 3-1 by superior enemies, you run. When you're outnumbered 50-17, you surrender and hope they kill you quickly. O'Brien stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the center of the room. But there's this funny thing about humans, Captain. When we get scared enough, when we get angry enough, when we decide that dying is inevitable anyway, we stop following standard tactical doctrine. The mess hall had become so quiet that the ambient hum of the station's systems seemed loud by comparison. Even the species that didn't breathe were holding whatever respiratory processes they used. Private Jackson was the first one to move, O'Brien said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. Kid from Detroit, 19 years old, barely finished basic training. Saw those bioforms closing in and just smiled. The veteran's own smile was a pale echo of something much more disturbing. He looked at the rest of us and said, "Well, boys, looks like we get to find out if those drill instructors were right about us being the meanest sons of bitches in the galaxy." O'Brien's hand moved to his uniform collar, where a small pin that most beings would have overlooked suddenly seemed significant. 17 humans against 50 bioform hunters. Should have been over in minutes. Instead, when the smoke cleared an hour later, there were parts of bioforms scattered across half a square kilometer of forest. Commander THYSS's voice was carefully controlled. "What were your casualties?" O'Brien was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still touching the small pin on his collar. "Jackson didn't make it," he said finally. Neither did Martinez or Singh. Kowalski lost an arm, but kept fighting until the medics forced him to stop bleeding on the ammunition. The human veteran looked around the room, meeting the eyes of alien soldiers who were beginning to understand that they might have seriously misjudged something important. "But here's the thing that really upset the Devourers," O'Brien continued. "We didn't just survive that encounter. We won it. And when word got out that a handful of human soldiers had wiped out an entire bioform pack, something changed." Private Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout the story, found his voice. "What changed, Sergeant?" O'Brien's expression became something that would have sent shivers down the spine of any human who saw it. The aliens in the room didn't have the cultural context to fully understand the expression, but their various threat assessment systems were all reaching the same conclusion. "The civilians stopped running," he said simply. "They started fighting back." The words settled over the mess hall like a physical weight. Sergeant O'Brien stood motionless in the center of the room, but the quality of stillness around him had changed. Where before there had been anticipation, now there was something approaching dread among the alien soldiers. Captain Zekthor's forked tongue flicked nervously as he processed the implications of what the human had said. Military doctrine across all known species emphasized the importance of civilian evacuation during hostile incursions. The idea that non-combatants would suddenly begin engaging professional military forces was not just unlikely. It was unprecedented. Civilians, the reptilian said carefully, are not trained for combat operations. Even motivated resistance movements require significant preparation and coordination to be effective. O'Brien nodded slowly, as if the captain had made a perfectly reasonable observation. "You're absolutely right. Farmers and shopkeepers and teachers don't make effective soldiers. Under normal circumstances." The sergeant began walking again, his steps taking him toward the large viewports that showed the star field beyond the station. "But, see, Captain, these weren't normal circumstances. And humans, well, humans aren't really normal either." He stopped before the reinforced transparent aluminum, staring out at the distant stars as if he could see something the others could not. Word spread faster than the Devourers could control. O'Brien continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone lost in memory. "Réfugié camp, survivor enclave, Eden settlement." The story got bigger with each telling, of course. That's how these things work. Lieutenant Vexhi's neural pathways pulsed with confusion. "What story?" "Your engagement with the bioforms was a minor tactical victory at best. Surely it wouldn't have strategic implications for civilian morale." O'Brien turned from the viewport and several alien soldiers unconsciously leaned back as his gaze swept across them. The story wasn't about tactics, Lieutenant. It was about possibility. For 3 days, everyone on that planet had been watching their world get eaten alive, watching their friends and families consumed by monsters that seemed unstoppable. They were living in a nightmare where nothing they did mattered. The veteran's voice grew quieter, but somehow more intense. Then, suddenly, they hear that 17 scared humans with basic weapons had killed 50 bioforms in a straight fight. Not through clever tactics or superior technology, just through sheer bloody-minded refusal to die quietly. Commander THYSS shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Even so, civilian morale has limited impact on military outcomes. Untrained individuals cannot significantly affect professional operations. O'Brien's smile was sharp enough to cut. That's where you're wrong, Commander. See, you're thinking like a professional soldier. You're analyzing this from the perspective of organized military doctrine. But humans don't always think professionally when they get angry enough. The sergeant moved to a different viewport, one that showed the industrial sections of the station. The first civilian attack happened 12 hours after the bioform engagement. A group of miners who'd been hiding in the deep shafts decided they'd had enough of being hunted. O'Brien's reflection in the transparent aluminum looked ghostly, overlaid against the stars beyond. 23 men and women with mining equipment and jury-rigged explosives. No military training, no tactical coordination, no hope of survival. They walked into a devourer processing facility and turned it into a crater. Graxon's mechanical translator struggled with the emotional undertones of his response. Suicide attacks are not unknown among various species. Desperate individuals sometimes attempt meaningless gestures. Meaningless, O'Brien repeated, tasting the word. I suppose that's one way to look at it. Except their attack wasn't meaningless to the construction workers who saw the explosion from 30 kilometers away, or to the teachers who were hiding with their students in an abandoned school. The human turned back to face the room, and his expression had taken on a quality that made several predator species unconsciously bare their weapons. Because suddenly, these people weren't just waiting to die anymore. They were seeing possibilities they hadn't considered before. Sub-Commander KLX Vex clicked her mandibles nervously. Individual acts of defiance cannot overcome systematic military superiority. The Devourers would have adapted to counter civilian resistance. They tried, O'Brien acknowledged. They started deploying hunter-killers specifically designed to track and eliminate small groups of irregulars, sealed the underground passages, monitored all electromagnetic communications. Very professional response. The sergeant's hands moved to rest on his belt, near where a sidearm would normally hang. But there's something about humans that I don't think your species databases account for. When you back us into a corner, when you take away everything we care about, we don't become more rational. We become more creative. Private Martinez found himself holding his breath, along with most of the other young humans in the room. The alien soldiers were displaying various signs of unease, though many tried to maintain facades of professional skepticism. The attacks started getting stranger, O'Brien continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that somehow made his words more disturbing. A group of engineers turned the planet's atmospheric processors into weapons. A handful of medical personnel used their knowledge of biology to create targeted pathogens. The veteran paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. And then there were the children. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Even species that didn't share human emotional responses to offspring protection seemed to sense they were approaching dangerous territory. Children, Commander Tichrises said carefully, would not be capable of effective resistance operations. O'Brien's expression became something that would have terrified any human who saw it. The aliens in the room lacked the cultural context to fully understand what they were witnessing, but their threat assessment systems were screaming warnings. You'd think so, wouldn't you? He said quietly. But it turns out that when human children watch their parents get eaten alive, they develop some very interesting psychological adaptations. The sergeant began walking again, but now his movement had the quality of something hunting. The Devourers had protocols for dealing with adult resistance. They understood fear, desperation, even fanaticism. What they weren't prepared for was pure hatred distilled into 12-year-old minds that had nothing left to lose. Captain Zekthor found himself leaning forward despite his better judgment. What did they do? O'Brien stopped walking and turned to face the reptilian captain directly. They became monsters. The words hung in the recycled air like a toxic cloud. Around the room, alien soldiers were beginning to reassess everything they thought they knew about human psychology. Not metaphorically, O'Brien continued, his voice remaining conversational despite the subject matter. Literally, they stopped thinking like children and started thinking like weapons. Small, fast, absolutely ruthless weapons that could go places and do things that adult humans couldn't manage. Lieutenant Vexhi's neural pathways were flashing erratically. That would be psychological trauma beyond any reasonable measurement. Yes, O'Brien agreed simply. It would be. And it was exactly what the Devourers couldn't handle. The veteran moved to another table, where a group of crystalline silicoids had been listening in geometric silence. See, the thing about Devourers is that their entire psychology is built around consumption and expansion. They understand prey and predators, resources and threats. What they don't understand is spite. One of the silicoids rotated its crystalline structure to focus more directly on the human. Spite is not a military advantage. Emotional responses are typically detrimental to tactical efficiency. O'Brien's laugh was completely without humor. Tell that to the Bioform Processing Center that got destroyed by a 10-year-old with a backpack full of improvised explosives. Tell that to the Hive node that got infected with a computer virus written by teenagers who learned programming from their school's educational system. The sergeant's voice was growing quieter again, but the effect was to make his words more rather than less intimidating. The Devourers tried to adapt. They started targeting children, specifically thinking they could eliminate the threat through systematic execution. What they accomplished instead was making every human adult on the planet completely insane with rage. Graxon's claws were now fully extended, scraping unconsciously against his meal tray. How does rage translate to military effectiveness? O'Brien turned to look at the massive Ursoid, and something in his expression made Graxon wish he hadn't asked the question. Rage doesn't make you more effective, the sergeant said quietly. It makes you more willing to try things that rational people would never consider, like strapping explosive charges to yourself and walking into enemy formations, like poisoning your own water supplies so the enemy can't use them, like teaching your children to build weapons instead of toys. The human began walking toward the center of the room again, and aliens who had been confidently mocking human legends an hour ago now found themselves unconsciously creating space around him. The war on Kepler 442b lasted 6 months, O'Brien continued. According to the official records, it ended when Galactic Defense Forces retook the system and drove off the remaining Devourer ships. Clean military operation, properly coordinated, textbook strategic success. He stopped walking and stood perfectly still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. What the official records don't mention is what the defense forces found when they arrived. Private Rodriguez's voice was barely a whisper. What do they find? O'Brien's smile was the most disturbing thing any being in the room had ever witnessed. They found a planet where 3 million human civilians had spent 6 months learning to be absolutely ruthless, where children played games involving the systematic torture of captured bioforms, where grandmothers discussed the most efficient ways to booby-trap corpses over afternoon tea. The sergeant's voice dropped to nearly a whisper, but every being in the room could hear him clearly. They found a world where ordinary humans had discovered they were very, very good at being monsters when someone gave them sufficient motivation. Commander HYSS was gripping her meal tray so tightly that her claws were leaving deep scratches in the metal. That would be a complete breakdown of civilian social order. It was, O'Brien agreed cheerfully. It took the Defense Forces 3 years of psychological rehabilitation programs to get the survivors functioning in normal society again. Some of them never quite managed it. The veteran looked around the room at the assembled alien soldiers, most of whom were now displaying obvious signs of discomfort or concern. But here's the really interesting part, he continued, his tone suggesting he was about to share a particularly amusing anecdote. The Devourers never attacked another human colony after Kepler 442b. Not once. They continued their expansion into other species' territories, but they started going around human space entirely. Subcommander KLX Vex clicked her mandibles in what might have been nervous confusion. That seems like an inefficient strategy. Human space includes several valuable systems. O'Brien nodded as if she had made an excellent point. It does seem inefficient, doesn't it? Unless you consider the cost-benefit analysis from their perspective. The sergeant moved to stand directly in front of the Chithari officer's table. See, the Devourers learned something very important about humans during those 6 months. They learned that when you threaten everything we care about, when you back us into corners with no hope of survival, we don't just fight back. His voice became softer, more intimate, as if he were sharing a secret. We become worse than you are. The silence that followed this statement was absolute. Even the station's environmental systems seemed to have paused in their operations. And that, O'Brien said, straightening up and brushing imaginary dust from his uniform, is why human legends aren't just stories. They're instruction manuals. The mess hall had transformed into something resembling a morgue. Where an hour ago there had been casual conversation and cruel laughter, now there was only the sound of various species breathing, or in some cases, not breathing as they processed what Sergeant O'Brien had just told them. The human veteran seemed completely unaware of the effect his words had produced. He straightened his uniform with casual precision, checked the time on his wrist display, and picked up his half-finished meal tray as if he had simply been sharing a mildly interesting training anecdote. Captain Zekthor found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual commanding tone. Instruction manuals? O'Brien paused in his meal consumption and looked up with the expression of someone who had been asked to clarify an obvious point. Well, yes. What did you think they were for? The reptilian's yellow eyes blinked slowly as his brain struggled to process this casual confirmation of everything he had just heard. We assumed they were entertainment. Cultural mythology designed to promote social cohesion through shared narratives. Oh, they do that too. O'Brien agreed pleasantly. But that's not their primary function. He took another bite of nutritional paste and continued speaking around it. Human children grow up hearing stories about individuals who accomplished impossible things through determination, courage, and creative problem-solving. By the time they're adults, those concepts feel normal to them. Lieutenant Vexhi's neural pathways were flickering erratically as she tried to reconcile this information with her understanding of human psychology. You're suggesting that humans deliberately condition their offspring to attempt irrational acts of heroism. Not irrational, O'Brien corrected mildly. Unprecedented. There's a difference. He set down his utensil and leaned back in his chair, suddenly, looking more like a college professor than a combat veteran. See, most species develop cultural narratives that emphasize the importance of following established patterns. Work within the system. Respect authority. Don't try to change things that are bigger than you are. The sergeant gestured toward the alien soldiers around the room. It's a sensible approach. It creates stable societies, reduces conflict, promotes efficient resource allocation. Very logical. Graxon's translator was working overtime to render his confused rumbling into standard galactic. But humans don't follow this pattern. O'Brien's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since entering the mess hall. Humans tell their children stories about farm boys who defeat galactic empires, about scientists who cure incurable diseases, about ordinary people who change the entire course of history through individual action. He stood up again, but this time his movement was relaxed rather than predatory. We teach our kids that when someone tells you something is impossible, the proper response is to prove them wrong. Commander THYSS was staring at the human with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex equation. That would create a civilization of individuals constantly challenging established order. The social disruption alone would be catastrophic. You'd think so, O'Brien acknowledged. But it turns out that when you have an entire species trained from childhood to look at impossible problems and think, I wonder if I can fix this, you get some interesting side effects. The veteran began walking again, but now his pace was leisurely, almost contemplative. Like teenagers who invent faster-than-light communication protocols because they're bored during summer vacation. Like farmers who solve energy crises by accident while trying to improve crop yields. Like janitors who revolutionize quantum mechanics because they noticed something their supervisors missed. Private Martinez was hanging on every word, as were most of the other young humans in the room. For the first time since arriving at the station, they were hearing something that made sense of their own cultural background in the context of galactic society. But surely, Subcommander KLX Vex interjected, such an approach would result in more failures than successes. The mathematics of individual action against systematic problems are fundamentally unfavorable. O'Brien nodded enthusiastically, as if she had made an excellent point. Absolutely right. For every human who successfully does something impossible, there are thousands who try and fail, sometimes spectacularly. He paused near one of the smaller tables where a group of floating Vorthins were contained in their environmental suits. The thing is, we don't tell stories about the failures. Well, not usually. We tell stories about the successes, and we make them sound inevitable. One of the Vorthins pulsed with confused electromagnetic patterns. This seems like a highly inefficient cultural programming method. It is, O'Brien agreed cheerfully. Wasteful, dangerous, psychologically damaging to a significant percentage of the population. Any rational species would have abandoned it millennia ago. The sergeant's expression became thoughtful. Except for one small problem. It works. He moved to stand near the large central table where Captain Zekthor and the other senior officers have been sitting. When the impossible becomes necessary, most species discover they don't have the psychological tools to handle it. Their cultural conditioning tells them to wait for proper authority to develop systematic solutions. O'Brien's voice took on that distant quality again, as if he were seeing something beyond the walls of the mess hall. Humans, on the other hand, have been preparing for impossible situations their entire lives. When everything goes wrong, when all the experts say there's no solution, when rational analysis indicates certain defeat, he paused, meeting each alien's gaze in turn. That's when we're at our most dangerous. The silence stretched out again, but this time it had a different quality. Where before there had been disbelief and growing unease, now there was something approaching comprehension among the alien soldiers. Commander THYSS was the first to break the quiet. The border wars weren't an anomaly. It wasn't a question, but O'Brien answered anyway. The border wars were Tuesday. He reached into another pocket and pulled out a small device that looked like a standard datapad. Would you like to see what Wednesday looked like? Before anyone could respond, he activated the device and gestured toward the large display screen that dominated one wall of the mess hall. Images began appearing. Official military footage, civilian recordings, surveillance data. The Hegemony War, O'Brien said conversationally as scenes of devastation flickered across the screen. 3 years after Kepler, 442b. The crystalline hegemony decided that carbon-based life was inefficient and needed to be converted to more suitable forms. The images showed massive geometric shifts, reducing entire planets to crystalline formations. They were very systematic about it. Very logical, started with isolated systems and worked their way toward the galactic core. Estimated timeline for complete conversion, 50 years. Captain Zekthor found himself leaning forward to get a better look at the tactical displays. I studied this conflict in military academy. The hegemony had overwhelming technological superiority. Their eventual defeat was attributed to innovative defense force strategies. O'Brien's laugh was completely without humor. The defense force strategies were indeed innovative. Mostly they involved staying very far away from hegemony forces while human volunteers did the actual work. New images appeared on the screen. Individual humans in improvised spacesuits, small groups working with primitive tools in impossible conditions. The hegemony's weakness was their reliance on centralized processing nodes. Destroy the nodes, and their conversion systems would shut down. Lieutenant Vexhigh's neural pathways were pulsing rapidly. But those nodes were located inside active conversion zones. The radiation levels alone would be lethal to most carbon-based life forms. Most, O'Brien agreed. But humans have this interesting psychological quirk. When someone tells us we can't survive something, we tend to interpret that as a challenge rather than a warning. The images shifted to show technical schematics and medical readouts. Radiation suits were available, of course. Standard military equipment, rated for short-term exposure in low-intensity fields. Completely inadequate for the mission requirements. Braxton's claws were scraping against his tray again. What did they do? O'Brien's smile was proud in a way that made several predator species unconsciously reassess their threat evaluations. They improvised. New footage appeared. Humans working in teams to modify their equipment, stripping components from damaged ships, jury-rigging systems that no rational engineer would have approved. Lead lining from destroyed buildings. Coolant systems from crashed fighters. Medical stimulants to keep crews conscious despite radiation poisoning. The sergeant's voice took on an almost nostalgic tone. Two-person teams. One to plant the charges, one to carry them out when the radiation sickness got too bad. Average life expectancy once they entered a conversion zone, for hours. Commander THYSS was staring at the screen with an expression of professional horror. That's not a military operation. That's systematic suicide. It was, O'Brien acknowledged. Except they kept volunteering. Faster than command could process the applications. Everyone wanted to be the one who got to blow up a hegemony node. The images shifted again, showing the aftermath of successful strikes. Crystalline structures collapsing, conversion fields flickering and dying, planets returning to their original forms. 37 successful missions. 37 processing nodes destroyed, each one requiring between 10 and 20 volunteer teams. Subcommander KLX Vex was clicking her mandibles in rapid patterns that her translator couldn't parse. The casualty rates must have been catastrophic. O'Brien nodded seriously. Nearly 100%. Most volunteers didn't survive long enough to escape the conversion zones even after successful detonations. But the thing about humans is we don't really think about casualty rates when we're angry enough. He gestured toward the screen, where new images were appearing. Hegemony command ships fleeing entire systems. Crystalline fleets avoiding sectors of space that had previously been targeted for conversion. After the 15th node was destroyed, the hegemony started avoiding human-inhabited systems. After the 25th, they began withdrawing from sectors adjacent to human space. The veteran's voice became softer, more intimate. After the 37th, they sent a diplomatic envoy to propose a ceasefire. Private Rodriguez found his voice. They surrendered? O'Brien turned to look at the young soldier with something that might have been pity. They tried to. The problem was, by that point, humans weren't really interested in ceasefires. The images on the screen shifted to show something that made several alien soldiers recoil from their seats. Human fleets pursuing retreating hegemony forces, not to capture or contain them, but to systematically hunt them down across dozens of systems. See, the hegemony had made the same mistake the Devourers made. O'Brien explained conversationally. They assumed that once they demonstrated their willingness to negotiate, humans would return to rational cost-benefit analysis. His smile was the most terrifying thing anyone in the room had ever witnessed. Instead, humans decided that any species willing to convert entire civilizations to crystal probably shouldn't be allowed to exist anywhere in the galaxy. The footage showed hegemony ships being torn apart by human forces that seemed to appear from nowhere, using tactics that violated every principle of conventional military doctrine. The war officially ended when the last hegemony vessel was destroyed. 18 months after they first proposed surrender. Commander THYSS's voice was barely a whisper. You committed genocide. O'Brien considered this for a moment, his expression becoming thoughtful. We committed extinction. There's a difference, though I'll admit it's subtle. He deactivated the datapad, and the screen went dark, leaving the mess hall illuminated only by the standard lighting arrays. The point is, Captain Zek Thor, when you mock human legends, you're not just insulting our entertainment. You're dismissing the operational manuals for the most dangerous military force in the galaxy. The reptilian captain was staring at the human sergeant with an expression that suggested he was seeing him clearly for the first time. You're not just soldiers. No, O'Brien agreed quietly. We're not just soldiers. We're humans. And there's a very important difference. He began walking toward the mess hall exit, but paused near the table of young human soldiers. The legends aren't about superhuman individuals accomplishing impossible things, he said, addressing them directly. They're about ordinary people discovering that impossible is just another word for untried. Private Martinez found the courage to ask the question that was burning in everyone's mind. Sergeant, what happens when someone pushes humans too far? O'Brien's final smile was gentle, almost paternal. They find out why the rest of the galaxy learned to be very, very polite. The mess hall remained frozen in stunned silence for several minutes after Sergeant O'Brien's departure. The veteran had left as casually as he'd entered, nodding politely to the young human soldiers and offering a respectful salute to the alien officers before walking out into the corridor as if he'd simply finished a routine meal. The beings he left behind sat in various states of shock, confusion, and growing understanding. Captain Zek Thor stared at the door through which the human had disappeared, his yellow eyes unblinking and his forked tongue motionless. The casual confidence with which O'Brien had described the systematic extinction of entire species was more disturbing than any threat or boast could have been. Commander HYSS was the first to break the silence. Her voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undertone that suggested she was rapidly reassessing everything she thought she knew about galactic politics. The historical records, she said slowly, addressing no one in particular. The border wars, the hegemony conflict, the Void Walker incursions. She paused, her reptilian features reflecting something approaching horror. They all have the same pattern. Subcommander KLX Vex clicked her mandibles nervously. What pattern? Initial aggression against human territories. Overwhelming enemy superiority. Impossible tactical situation. Commander HYSS's claws were leaving deep grooves in the metal table. And then, complete reversal of strategic momentum, followed by the total elimination of the hostile force. Lieutenant Vexhi's neural pathways were flashing in rapid sequences as she accessed military databases through her implanted connection systems, cross-referencing historical data with Sergeant O'Brien's account. The official records consistently described these conflicts as defense force victories achieved through superior strategy and coordination. She paused, her translucent skin showing the glow of increased neural activity. But when I filter for human casualty rates and volunteer applications for high-risk missions, the pattern becomes disturbing. Graxon's massive frame was trembling slightly, though whether from fear or something else was unclear. What do you mean, disturbing? Human volunteer rates for missions classified as certain death consistently exceed available positions by factors of 10 to 1 during major conflicts. Vexhi replied, her voice taking on the detached tone of someone reporting statistical data. Furthermore, psychological profiles of volunteers show no evidence of suicidal ideation or mental instability. The ethereal paused, her neural pathways pulsing more rapidly. They're not volunteering to die. They're volunteering to accomplish something before they die. The distinction appears to be culturally significant. At the human table, Private Martinez was staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. Is that true? About the volunteer rates? Corporal Chun, who had been silent throughout O'Brien's entire presentation, nodded slowly. My older brother applied for hazardous duty 17 times before he finally got accepted for a deep space reconnaissance mission. He said the waiting list was longer than some species' entire military rosters. Private Rodriguez looked confused. But why? If the missions are that dangerous, why do so many people want them? Chin's expression became distant, as if she were trying to recall something important. He told me it wasn't about the danger. It was about being the person who got to try. The simplicity of this statement seemed to hit the alien soldiers like a physical blow. Around the room, beings who had spent their entire careers analyzing military psychology and tactical doctrine were struggling to process the concept of an entire species that treated impossible missions as opportunities rather than punishments. Captain Zek Thor finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. How many? The question hung in the air without context, but somehow everyone understood what he was asking. Lieutenant Vexhi consulted her neural implant again, accessing databases that most beings in the room probably weren't clear to view. Confirmed military engagements involving human forces against hostile alien species. 47 major conflicts over the past 2 centuries. She paused, her skin growing brighter as she processed more data. Human victory rate, 100%. That's impossible, Subcommander KLX Vex protested. No species maintains perfect victory rates over extended periods. Even the most advanced civilizations experience occasional defeats. Define defeat, Vexhi replied with the mechanical precision of someone quoting statistical analysis. If defeat means failing to achieve strategic objectives, then humans have never been defeated. If defeat means accepting higher casualty rates than the enemy, then humans lose every engagement. Graxon's claws were now fully extended, scraping against the table's surface in patterns that suggested extreme agitation. But if they take heavier losses, how do they maintain operational capability? Population replacement rates, Vexhi answered immediately. Human reproductive cycles are optimized for rapid population growth under adverse conditions. Additionally, their cultural mythology actively encourages individuals to view military service as a path to personal fulfillment rather than sacrifice. The ethereal neural pathways were now flashing so rapidly that they created a stroboscopic effect in the dim lighting of the mess hall. But there's another factor. When I cross-reference human military operations with psychological profiles of enemy survivors, I find consistent reports of something the translators render as demoralization beyond statistical models. Commander THYSS leaned forward, her professional interest overriding her growing unease. Explain. Enemy forces consistently report that human tactics produce psychological effects disproportionate to their actual military impact, Vex High continued, her voice becoming more mechanical as she accessed deeper data streams. Hostile species describe human soldiers as fighting like cornered animals or displaying suicidal disregard for tactical reality. She paused, her skin flickering as she processed additional information. More significantly, enemy command structures consistently develop what their own psychologists classify as paralyzing uncertainty when facing human forces. Private Martinez found himself leaning forward unconsciously. What kind of uncertainty? Vex High turned her attention to the young human soldier, and her expression was difficult to read through the alien features. They become unable to predict human responses to standard tactical situations. Traditional military doctrine assumes that all rational actors will prioritize unit survival and strategic advantage. Human forces consistently violate these assumptions. The ethereal gestured toward her data displays, which were invisible to the others but apparently showed concerning information. Enemy commanders report feeling like they're fighting an opponent that doesn't understand basic military principles. They describe it as trying to play chess with someone who doesn't know the rules but keeps winning anyway. Corporal Chin's voice was quiet but carried clearly across the suddenly still mess hall. Maybe we do know the rules. Maybe we just use different ones. The statement produced another wave of silence as the alien soldiers contemplated its implications. The idea that human military doctrine might be based on fundamentally different assumptions about warfare was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Captain Zekthor had been staring at the table since O'Brien's departure, but now he looked up with an expression that suggested he was struggling with concepts that didn't fit into his worldview. The mocking, he said slowly. We were mocking your legends because they seemed impossible. But they're not legends at all, are they? At the human table, the young soldiers exchanged glances before Corporal Chun answered for all of them. No, sir. They're not legends. They're examples. The weight of this revelation settled over the mess hall like a physical presence. Around the room, alien soldiers who had considered themselves professional warriors were beginning to understand that they had been sharing their meal with representatives of something that didn't quite fit into any of their existing categories. Subcommander KLX Vex clicked her mandibles in what might have been nervous laughter. Examples of what? Private Rodriguez, who had been silent for most of the evening, looked up with an expression of growing confidence. Of what's possible when you stop worrying about what's impossible. The simplicity of this statement somehow made it more rather than less unsettling. The alien soldiers were beginning to realize that what they had interpreted as primitive mythology was actually a sophisticated psychological conditioning system designed to produce individuals capable of accomplishing things that rational analysis suggested couldn't be done. Lieutenant Vexai was still accessing military databases, her neural pathways now flashing in complex patterns that suggested she was correlating information from multiple sources. I'm finding additional data that supports Sergeant O'Brien's accounts. The Nexus Rebellion, the Phantom Fleet incident, the Silicon Valley Protocols. She paused, her skin brightening with what appeared to be excitement or alarm. Each conflict follows the same pattern. Humans encounter an impossible situation, ignore conventional wisdom about why it can't be solved, and then systematically dismantle the problem through methods that shouldn't work but do. Commander THYSS was gripping her meal tray so tightly that her claws had punched completely through the metal. How many species have humans eliminated? The question emerged as barely more than a whisper, but it carried across the silent mess hall like a shout. Vexai consulted her data streams again, and her expression became something that transcended alien features to convey universal unease. 17 confirmed extinctions. 23 additional species that simply disappeared from galactic communications after initiating hostilities against human territories. She looked around the room at the assembled alien soldiers. Statistical analysis suggests that aggressive action against human-controlled space has a mortality rate of approximately 98% for the aggressing species. Braxton's voice was barely audible through his translator. What about the other 2%? They surrendered immediately upon detecting human response forces and have since become what the diplomatic corps classifies as voluntary client states. Vexai replied. Current status: extremely cooperative. The mess hall had become so quiet that the ambient hum of the station's life support systems seemed loud by comparison. Dozens of professional soldiers from the most advanced military cultures in the galaxy were contemplating the possibility that they had been sharing their base with representatives of the most dangerous species anyone had ever encountered. Private Martinez broke the silence with a question that seemed almost naive given the context. Sergeant O'Brien seemed nice, though, like a regular person. Commander THYSS turned to look at the young human with an expression that might have been pity. That might be the most frightening thing about your species. You're regular people, which means there are billions more like him. The implications of this statement spread through the room like ripples in still water. The alien soldiers were beginning to understand that what made humans dangerous wasn't that they were naturally aggressive or inherently violent. It was that they were ordinary individuals who had been culturally programmed to treat impossible challenges as routine problems requiring creative solutions. Captain Zek Thor stood slowly, his movement careful and deliberate. Around the room, other senior officers followed his example, rising from their seats with the formal precision of beings participating in a ceremony they didn't entirely understand but recognized as necessary. Corporal Chun, the reptilian, said, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been present earlier in the evening. Yes, sir. Please extend our apologies to Sergeant O'Brien. We were uninformed about the nature of human military traditions. Chin nodded slowly, her expression suggesting she was still processing everything that had happened. I'll make sure he gets the message, sir. As the alien officers filed out of the mess hall, each offered some form of acknowledgement to the young human soldiers. Nods, salutes, respectful gestures that transcended species barriers. The casual mockery of an hour ago had been replaced by something approaching ceremonial recognition. When the last alien had departed, the humans sat alone at their table, staring at meal trays they had forgotten in the midst of O'Brien's revelations. Well, Private Martinez said finally, that was educational. Corporal Chun smiled for the first time since arriving at the station. Wait until they find out about our other legends. Other legends? Rodriguez asked. Chin's smile became something that would have made Sergeant O'Brien proud. Like the one about how humans respond when someone threatens their friends. Outside the mess hall, alien soldiers hurried through the corridors toward their quarters, each carrying the uncomfortable knowledge that they had been serving alongside representatives of a species that treated extinction-level threats as training exercises. In his small office near the training facilities, Sergeant William O'Brien reviewed reports from the evening's classes and prepared lesson plans for the next day's instruction. He hummed quietly to himself as he worked, completely unaware that his casual conversation over dinner had just revolutionized galactic military doctrine and earned humanity a level of respect that most species required centuries of diplomatic effort to achieve. After all, he was just a regular person doing a regular job. The fact that his regular job involved training young humans to accomplish impossible things was simply the way things had always been. It was, as he had mentioned to the alien officers, just another Tuesday.